By the time 1918 rolled around, the fate of World War I and the millions of people involved in World War I came down to the sanity or lack thereof of one individual. German general and, by this point in the war, de facto military dictator of Germany, Erich Ludendorff, was always a lonely guy. He was never good at making friends. He was seen as too stern, not open with his emotions, not particularly interested in the frivolities of life. Even from a young age, as a schoolboy, he was never able to make any long-lasting or significant friendships or even romantic acquaintances. But all of that changed at age 44. He was out in a rainstorm and he saw a beautiful woman without an umbrella. He offered his umbrella to her, and many people have said, miraculously, from Ludendorff's perspective, they were married soon after. Some historians argue that when Ludendorff inherited his wife's 3 stepsons, that this kind of filled the void of his loneliness. Ludendorff would help all 3 stepsons to get jobs as pilots in the German army, and this is where things began to unravel for Erich Ludendorff. One stepson was shot down earlier in the war, and another one in 1918. Ludendorff was told of a fresh grave that said, "Here rest 2 German pilots." Sure enough, Ludendorff had the graves dug up and was able to identify another of his stepsons. It's tough to imagine the feelings he must have been going through as that process was unfolding. But it was around this time that people close to Ludendorff began to report signs of psychological instability. He was having nervous breakdowns where he would collapse to the floor in fits of unstable emotions. He just seemed more and more irrational as things were going along during 1918. People close to him would report occasional bouts of crying, and Ludendorff began to see a psychiatrist. Here's what the psychiatrist said, quote, "I talked earnestly, urgently, and warmly, and said that I had noticed with great sadness that for years he had given no consideration to one matter, his own spirit, always only work, worry, straining his body and mind. No recreation, no joy, rushing his food, not breathing, not laughing, not seeing anything of nature and art, not hearing the rustle of the forest, nor the splashing of the brook. The man is utterly lonely." End quote. The psychiatrist would recommend breathing exercises, more relaxation, better sleep. And this whole story is really a great example of how nobody was immune from World War I. Not even the most powerful man in Germany, maybe the most powerful man in Europe, could avoid the devastating effects of the war. And it's also something to keep in mind and an important lesson to learn here that personal factors related to someone's psychology and personal life and the way they feel about the world and view the world can have major impacts on the way history shakes out. We're going to start getting into some of the irrational decisions and poor judgment that Erich Ludendorff exhibits in this last year of the war that really contribute to Germany's demise. And furthermore, Ludendorff would play a role in attempts to overthrow the Weimar Republic later in Germany's history, basically standing side by side with Hitler in that regard. But if what this psychiatrist is saying is accurate, that a lot of what Ludendorff is going through and a lot of the poor decisions he's making is based on personal factors and personal relationships, then that's an important lesson to take away from all of this, that the ebb and flow of history can change based on an accumulation of small and seemingly personal matters. I think it makes sense to look at the overall situation of the war in 1918 really before we get into too many of the epic battles that go on the Western Front that are going to determine the fate of World War I. At this point in the war, the Allies are pretty beaten up. They have no initial plans to launch any big offensives in 1918. Their original plan was kind of to recover, deal with a German offensive that they knew was coming, and then go from there. But if the Allies were beaten up, then Germany and the Central Powers were in even worse shape. As we've talked about in the previous episodes, Austria-Hungary was in shambles. Materials and food were in short supply. The military was actually issued paper underwear at one point, just as an example of how desperate things were getting. Many troops were deserting. There was roving bands of deserting troops, barbarizing and terrorizing local populations. And over the course of 1918, Austria-Hungary would fade out of the war. A very similar situation was happening in Turkey, where the Ottoman Empire was sustaining losses and beginning to fade away. The old sick man of Europe was finally getting an illness that it couldn't recover from. The Ottomans were probably overextended on their northern front, and in the Middle East they were dealing with the British and an Arab revolt led in part by Lawrence of Arabia, who would gain much fame over the course of the war and after the war. The key to understand here is that the Ottoman Empire was huge and made up of all sorts of different ethnic peoples and religions and things like this. So the British, understanding this, kind of cajoled and bribed the Arab tribes to revolt against the Ottomans. They promised them autonomy, territory, support, etc. A British liaison by the name of Thomas Edward Lawrence, who would later become Lawrence of Arabia, was an academic, mostly. He studied at Oxford, where he learned about the Arabian world. He was good at map making, and his skills were needed by the British. So they sent him to Cairo as a map maker and also to use his skills as an analyst. He became a liaison to the Arab tribes. Eventually, he became a friend with one of the leaders, Prince Faisal Hussein. Their exploits would be legendary as guerrilla fighters and leaders of this Arab revolt, but unfortunately for Lawrence of Arabia and the Arab tribes, somewhat ironically, it was all built on sand. He was being duped, and the Arabs were being duped. The British and the French had already agreed to something called the SykesPicot Agreement, where they agreed to split up the Middle East between themselves. The Bolsheviks actually published this as kind of a screw you to the Allies, but anyway, once it got out, it showed that certain segments of the Middle East would go to Britain, certain segments would go to France, and the Arabian Peninsula, home of the Arab tribes, was going to be divided into spheres of influence. So nominally, these would be controlled by Arabs, but everyone knew Europeans would ultimately be in control. Lawrence would adopt the style and dress of the Arabs, and he lobbied for them at Versailles at the end of the war, but ultimately it would all be for naught, and he would fade into obscurity slowly after that. That's a fascinating subject in and of itself, but for our purposes here, by the middle of 1918, the Ottomans would essentially be done with World War I, in large part due to this revolt. Fighting in the Balkans would wind down in 1918 when the Bulgarian troops, with help from the Germans, would get crushed by the Allies near Salonika. Even victories for the Germans were not going according to plan. A great example of this is the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was signed on March 3, 1918, and it was one of the most one-sided treaties in all of history. On the pro side, Germany took over huge parts of Eastern territory, including Finland, Poland, Ukraine, other territories. They knocked the Russians out of the war, of course, and the theory was that these new territories could provide materials and manpower and stuff for the war effort. Unfortunately, the cons for Germany of Brest-Litovsk outweighed the pros, and the con for Germany is the same thing. They now have these huge parts of territory in the east, including Finland, Poland, Ukraine, and other areas that they now have to administer. They have to send troops into these areas to help secure them. The amount of food they're getting is not as much as they thought because the hundreds of thousands of troops they're sending to subdue these areas are actually eating most of it. And the whole thing just turns out to be a waste of resources that aren't necessary to win the war and actually could be used on the Western Front. It's unclear how much Ludendorff was even thinking about this when he and the rest of the German government was dictating terms at Brest-Litovsk. It's pretty clear that Ludendorff, at least, didn't care about administration of these areas or the trappings of empire. He just wanted to win. And what he saw was a big area that now belonged to Germany on the map, so that's a win. Even though you now have to deal with all of the bureaucratic problems that go along with that big addition to the empire. All of these events, including the stuff that's going on with Germany's allies, is happening throughout the course of 1918, but the point of it all is there's definitely a sense among German leaders, even early in 1918, that they need to win this thing in 1918, especially with things falling apart for their allies and United States troops coming in more and more as every week goes by. The feeling by the people in charge in Germany, and in particular Ludendorff, was that we need to win World War I in 1918, otherwise we're not going to win. Ludendorff's plan in 1918 to win the war was a series of massive offensives. So here's what he said, quote, "We make a whole and the rest will take care of itself," end quote. The idea was to knock the British out of the war, and then from there they could dictate terms to the French. If you imagine the Western Front as a long, jagged line going from Belgium down into France, almost all the way to Switzerland, the first part of Ludendorff's plan was to launch a huge offensive known as Operation Michael, right in between the areas that the British controlled and that the French controlled. For lack of a better term, it's in the middle of the Western Front near an area called St. Quentin. The idea behind it was to soften up the British a little bit and then get them to move some of their reserve troops down to deal with that new offensive, and then you unleash a new offensive in the north in Flanders where Ludendorff really wanted to deal the death blow to the British. But like Ludendorff said, there was plenty of room for improv here. So he said, we make a whole and the rest will take care of itself. So sometimes Ludendorff deviated from the script a little bit, and it's a bit confusing to figure out what he was doing or how these battles unfolded. But the basic idea is that the Germans, from about March to the end of July, are going to launch 3 huge offensives. One kind of in the middle of the Western Front that we talked about, Michael, the one to the north in Flanders called Georgette, and then a third and final one more on the southern part of the Western Front closer to Verdun. Ludendorff had a bunch of tricks up his sleeve for all 3 offensives. For the most part, he took his youngest and best troops and put them into units and divisions together and put them at the tip of the spear. He had about 3 million men at his disposal, which was the best of the best that was left in the German army. They also used new tactics. They were organized into small assault groups, and the goal was to get behind enemy lines and cause havoc, then use your judgment on what to do next. Maybe instead of destroying everything in front of you and then slowly moving, kind of bite and hold tactics, the new strategy was send these assault groups, get them behind enemy lines, and then you can clean everybody else up later. The Germans released a military pamphlet talking about these new tactics and talking about how they shouldn't be going by the old ways of doing things. These new rules are what is now going to apply. Here's what it says, quote, "The objective of the first day must be at least the enemy's artillery. The objective of the second day depends on what is achieved on the front. There must be no rigid adherence to plans made beforehand. The reserves must be put in where the attack is progressing, not where it is held up." End quote. The idea is to send in these storm troops first, these smaller assault groups, have them create havoc behind the lines, maybe get to the enemy artillery, follow that up by a more well-armed and heavy infantry to exploit any breakthroughs and the chaos that that storm troop group is probably creating. Of course, all this is preceded by a much more sophisticated artillery barrage than had come before. So they didn't do a heavy barrage for days, sometimes even weeks at a time, like the British did at the Somme or at Passchendaele, because they thought that all that does is signal the enemy that you're about to attack, and it gets them ready to defend. So instead, they decided to rotate different types of artillery shells, explosive, shrapnel, gas, make the bombardments shorter, and vary the targets. So you hit the front lines first, then you hit the back lines, and then you rotate between the two, and it throws the enemy off guard. During these offensives, the new German tactics were going against both the old Allied tactics as far as defense goes and some new tactics. So the old tactics were basically the idea of you need to hold your ground and hold every inch of territory no matter what. This is what the new German strategy was designed to beat, and it did. But when they went against the new tactics of defense, advocated by a guy like Pétain, who issued something called Directive Number 4, where he wanted to make his front line flexible. There's no need to hold to every inch of territory. What you want to do is kind of what the Germans did the year before, which is to create that miles-deep killing zone where you can slowly retreat and lure the enemy in and continue to kill them. So in these offensives of 1918, where the Germans went against the old tactics, they had a lot of success. Where they went against the new tactics, they didn't have much success. But where the Germans did have success, they had huge success. So there were huge breakthroughs, and miles of territory were captured in just a few days in many cases. Many of the Allied generals were completely panicked, and in particular the British were very frustrated at first. But many of the Allied commanders, and even a lot of the German commanders, were thinking a little bit ahead. Because what the Germans were doing was these new offensives where they were breaking through were creating huge salients. Because they weren't breaking through at everywhere all at once, there were small pockets where the German lines were jutting forward sometimes dozens of miles. This means that you're now vulnerable from the north and from the south. You now have 3 areas you need to defend yourself from. And if you don't get backed up with appropriate supplies and manpower, you're in danger of getting closed off from the rest of your army and getting encircled. Here's historian G.J. Meyer talking about this development. He's talking about the aftermath of Operation Michael here, but the same principle applies for the other ones. Quote, "The Germans had captured 1,200 square miles, 90,000 prisoners, more than 1,000 guns, and mountains of supplies. They had inflicted more than 160,000 casualties on the British, the men taken prisoner included, and 70,000 on the French, but 160,000 of their own best troops had been killed or wounded as well, and 70,000 had been taken prisoner. And all the ground they had won was worthless or less than worthless. It included not a single place of true strategic value. The German line had been lengthened by 50 miles at the same time that the number of troops available to defend that line had been significantly reduced. In moving forward into a huge and worthless new salient, the Germans had left behind the best defensive infrastructure on the Western Front. They had to start from scratch on ground where they had no finished defenses, no support system, no anything." End quote. The best analogy I can come up with here is that of a rubber band. In these spots where the Germans were attacking, they were taking huge amounts of territory, and imagine stretching that rubber band more and more and more. The problem is, without the supply lines and without advanced planning and the manpower needed to take advantage of that, the rubber band was getting more and more stretched, and it was becoming more and more weak, until eventually what's going to happen? It's either going to snap, or it's going to fly back and hit you even worse than what you were trying to do in the first place. And that's exactly what's going to happen during 1918. The Allies are going to strike back and counterattack, and it's going to cause the German army basically to fold. German troops are incredibly exhausted. They're now overstretching their supply lines, and they're getting attacked by an increasingly united Allied force. By this point in the war, Ferdinand Foch had been named Supreme War Commander, so he was able to coordinate French, British, and American troops together to better combat the Germans. American troops were pouring into the continent more each month, and they were really contributing successfully to a lot of these battles. And eventually, Ludendorff has no choice but to pull back to the Hindenburg Line in sort of a disorderly retreat. German troops were exhausted. Here's a couple examples. One soldier said, quote, "Midnight, time to leave, to escape the annihilating fire at daybreak," end quote. Interestingly, here's a British soldier talking about German POWs. He's comparing older POWs that they captured during battles like the Somme and other battles early in the war versus the POWs they're capturing now, and he's saying these POWs just seem more exhausted and they seem less willing to fight. Here's what he says, quote, "I've seen prisoners coming from the Battle of the Somme, Mons, and Messines, and along the road to Menin. Then they had an expression of hard defiance on their faces. Their eyes were saying, 'You've had the better of me, but there are many others like me, still to carry on the fight, and in the end we shall crush you.' Now their soldiers are no more than a pitiful crowd, exhaustion of the spirit, which always accompanies exhaustion of the body. They are marked with the sign of the defeated," end quote. By this point in the war, Ludendorff had asked a malnourished, underfed, and increasingly disease-ridden army to go on offensives that they couldn't sustain. The Spanish flu of 1918 was spreading in both armies, but it was worse in Germany because those troops were more malnourished and they were underfed and they had less nutrition. Ultimately, a combination of Anzac, Canadian, U.S., British, and French forces would fight ferociously, inflicting huge casualties and breakthroughs, and it became desperation time for Germany towards the end of 1918. Just as a side note, the troops for the United States fought incredibly courageously and bravely, but not always the most intelligently. The general in charge, Pershing, was resistant to learning new techniques on the Western Front, and he kind of wanted to do things his own way, and what you get is some courageous offensives, but a lot of probably unnecessary deaths. Here's one American soldier talking about how he's on the offensive and he kind of loses track of his objective and assignment, but he still carries on. Quote, "We literally lost each other. There were no bugles, no flags, no drums, and as far as we knew, no heroes. The great noise was like great stillness. Everything seemed blotted out. We hardly knew where the Germans were. We were simply in a big black spot with streaks of screaming red and yellow, with roaring giants in the sky tearing and whirling and roaring. There was a great swishing scream, a smash bang, and it seems to tear everything loose from you. The intensity of it simply enters your heart and brain and tears every nerve to pieces. Although so many men had been killed, there was nothing to do but keep on going. A shell burst above my head. It tore out a piece of my shoulder blade and collarbone and knocked me down. It was a terrible blow, but I was not unconscious. I think it was the bursting of the shell, the air concussion which knocked me down, and not the shell itself. It was not 5 seconds, it seemed, before a medical corps man was dressing my wounds. He cut my coat away from the wound and wrapped up my shoulder in such a way that it would not bleed too much. As he lifted me from the ground, I looked at my 4 runners, and I saw that the 2 in the middle had been cut down to a pile of horrid red guts and blood and meat, while the 2 men on the outside had been cut up somewhat less badly, but no less fatally. It reminded me of nothing I had ever seen before, except a Christmas hog butchering back on the Texas farm." End quote. So the Americans didn't have a ton of experience with World War I, and they seemed to have a poor tactical grasp of what was going on the Western Front, but they kept going, and they were admired for their courage, and their losses were intense. But they also dealt significant losses to the Germans. By the end of October 1918, these Allied counterattacks and breakthroughs they were having spelled the end for the German army. Ludendorff knew that this meant defeat for the Germans. He resigns on October 25th. Kaiser Wilhelm II would abdicate the throne soon after that. And from a military perspective, the German army was thoroughly defeated. There's a little bit of a myth that the German army was not defeated and that the army was undefeated in World War I, but that's just simply not true. Here's what historian Peter Hart has to say about that, quote, "It has often been contended that Germany was not really defeated in the Great War, but that her heroic armed services were somehow stabbed in the back by revolutionary factors or other mysterious forces. This is utter nonsense. Rarely has a nation been so comprehensively defeated in the field as Germany was in 1918. Her armies were reeling back and were totally unable to defend the German frontier. At sea, the Germans had been bottled up, their submarines overwhelmed by the convoy system, and the high seas fleet had mutinied. In the air, the German pilots were fighting bravely, but were severely outnumbered and fast running out of aviation fuel. Her allies, Austria-Hungary, Turkey, and Bulgaria, had all been brought to their knees. There was no hope anywhere for Germany. This was a total defeat writ large." End quote. The Germans initially reached out to Woodrow Wilson to try and get a more, from their perspective, fair armistice peace, but Wilson was under increasing pressure to be tough on Germany. This was the line that British and France were taking. Republicans in Congress were trying to paint Wilson as weak for not punishing the Germans enough. And with the midterm elections of 1918 coming up, Woodrow Wilson basically didn't want to do anything to jeopardize things one way or the other, so he basically says that the armistice terms are going to be settled with the commanders in the field, not with me. A German delegation would be sent to Allied headquarters to receive and sign the terms of the armistice. The terms were that the Germans had to withdraw to east of the Rhine River. They had to withdraw from all their territories on the Eastern Front. They had to tear up the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, surrender large numbers of guns and artillery, surrender all their colonies in Africa, and the Allied blockade of Germany was going to continue until the treaty was signed. What's interesting here is that neither side was really happy with the terms of the initial armistice. The French general Mangin, also known as the Butcher, said, quote, "We must go right into the heart of Germany. The armistice should be signed there. The Germans will not admit that they are beaten. You do not finish wars like this. It is a fatal error, and France will pay for it." End quote. He's saying, look, we need to dismantle Germany completely, and we need to do it in the heart of Berlin, or this whole thing is going to be a waste. Many people on the Allied side felt that way. The drive to punish the Germans for, in their eyes, starting the war and all the deaths and destruction it caused was tremendous, especially when we look at what happens with the Treaty of Versailles. Many Germans hated the armistice for exactly the opposite reason, thinking that it was too harsh. Here's one seaman by the name of Richard Stumpf talking about the German perspective. Quote, "I read the fateful sheet with bated breath and growing amazement. What were the terms? Evacuation of the left bank of the Rhine as well as the right to an extent of 40 kilometers. 150,000 railroad cars, 10,000 automobiles, 5,000 heavy guns, the blockade to remain in effect, the Navy to be surrendered. It can't be. This is ridiculous. It means a fight to the end. What a sudden change from the joy we had felt that morning. This is what you get for your goddamn brotherhood," I shouted to the suddenly silent spectators. It was too much for me to bear, and I hurried off to grieve in a lonely corner. The last of the rockets exploded. One siren after the other was turned silent, but within me the storm still raged, as I was convulsed to the very core of my soul by a deep and terrible anguish. It is sheer madness to subject an industrious and undefeated nation such as ours to these shameful terms. End quote. Emotions like this on both sides do a great job of illustrating how in 1918, by the end of 1918, the war was over and the fighting was over, but the stage was just being set for many of the disasters that would unfold after the war as a direct result of what happened, and in particular from the terms of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. As historian Peter Hart said, the war was over, but the hatred would linger on.